Hey guys, tonight we unroll a stack of parchment that was never meant for your eyes. Imagine dim candlelight flickering over ink-stained hands, the scratching of a quill filling a silence that is far from innocent. You can almost hear a heartbeat racing as words spill out, words too dangerous to say aloud. They are not battle plans, not financial ledgers, but confessions of longing tucked away with trembling fingers. Somewhere a door creaks and you realize that you probably wouldn't survive this kind of secrecy in a medieval household where gossip traveled faster than pigeons and one wrong glance could undo you entirely. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And of course, drop your location and the local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're listening from, whether it's New York at 2 a.m. or a quiet village in Wales at sunrise. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself holding a letter not written for you, its edges curled with age, its ink faded to a brown that once was black. The confession inside feels as alive as the day it was written. In the Middle Ages, love letters were not casual exchanges. They were weapons, lifelines, and sometimes death sentences. The act of putting desire into words was bold, almost reckless, because parchment lived longer than flesh. The first thing you notice is how private they feel. Many were written in Latin or Old French, sometimes even in deliberate gibberish that only the intended reader could decipher. Some used metaphors so exaggerated they would make a modern emoji blush. Imagine writing about the falcon that longs to perch upon your hand, when really you're just trying to say, "I miss you terribly, and please don't marry that other guy." Historians still argue whether these letters represent actual lived romance, or if they were mostly literary exercises practiced by bored nobles. But when you see smudged lines and hurried corrections, you can feel the human trembling behind the ink. It's hard to fake that kind of urgency, a mainstream fact to anchor you. By the 12th century, the culture of courtly love had swept across Europe. Noble courts celebrated refined, secretive romance, where knights pledged themselves to ladies, usually someone else's wife. Love letters were the lifeblood of this ritual, a way to sustain passion when appearances demanded distance. It wasn't all roses, though. If discovered, those folded scraps could be used as evidence in church courts, proving adultery or scandal. But here's a quirky tidbit. Some letters weren't even written by the lovers themselves. Professional scribes offered romantic ghostwriting services, penning love notes with just the right balance of subtlety and passion. It was the medieval equivalent of paying someone to polish your dating profile, except instead of being ghosted, you might literally end up ghosted. Picture this. You sneak your letter into a sleeve, press it into the palm of a trusted servant, and hope it reaches your beloved without being intercepted. Along the way, the parchment absorbs more than words. Some writers sprinkled crushed rose petals into the folds, hoping their perfume might linger across the miles. Others pressed lips against the paper, leaving faint, waxy marks of devotion. You can't help but smile at the thought that centuries later, scholars sometimes still find traces of perfume clinging to these pages. As you trail your fingers across the parchment, you notice something odd. A blot of ink where someone hesitated, as though unsure whether to confess or retreat. That hesitation is a whisper across time. Someone risked it all for love. It reminds you that love letters were less about communication and more about survival. Emotional survival in marriages arranged for politics, survival of passion when physical meetings were impossible, survival of the soul in a world where desire was condemned yet irresistible. You might be drifting now, the edges of your mind curling like the parchment in your hands, but linger a little longer, because this is only the beginning. Soon you'll see how even wax seals could make or break lives, how every tiny choice in ink and phrasing could tilt the balance between secrecy and scandal. For now, though, you simply fold the letter closed, tuck it under your pillow, and let its words pulse faintly like a forbidden heartbeat in the dark. You hold the letter up to the candlelight, and what first seemed like harmless words now feels heavier than iron chains. It isn't just what was written inside, it's how it was sealed. In the Middle Ages, wax wasn't just melted decoration. It was a contract, a declaration of trust, and sometimes the flimsiest lock standing between privacy and ruin. The wax itself came in different colours. Red was common, a deep crimson made from a mixture of beeswax and resin, but nobles sometimes used green or black to distinguish their status, and if you were truly wealthy, you might stamp your family crest into it with a signet ring, pressing your authority right into the soft surface. Breaking that seal without permission was more than nosiness. It was a crime, one that could drag you before a bishop, or worse. Still, you can almost picture a curious maid holding a letter up to the steam of a kettle, carefully softening the wax to peek inside. People were nosy back then too. Human curiosity hasn't evolved much. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Medieval law treated sealed letters as protected communication, almost sacred in their inviolability. Tampering could bring charges of forgery or breach of trust. Yet love letters constantly flirted with this danger. Imagine being a wife in a castle, slipping a sealed note under a tapestry to be collected later. If your husband found it, the wax alone was evidence of secrecy. You wouldn't need words, the seal said enough. And yet, a quirky tidbit, sometimes lovers deliberately broke their own seals. Why? To leave the parchment folded but unsealed, signalling to their partner that they trusted them implicitly. It's the medieval equivalent of leaving your phone unlocked face up on the table, as if to say, "See, no secrets here," which of course was hilariously ironic, since the very act of writing the letter was usually the biggest secret of all. You might think a wax seal was hard to fake, but medieval forgers were skilled. Historians still argue whether some intercepted letters were resealed by jealous spouses or political rivals, using copied impressions to make them look untouched. Even now, scholars debate whether certain wax traces in archives suggest original secrecy or careful tampering. Forensic historians have literally compared the grooves of wax seals like detectives studying fingerprints. You glance again at the folds. The letter feels less like a love note and more like a ticking clock. If someone intercepted it, it could serve as evidence in a church court. Adultery cases often hinged on such things. There's a recorded case in 14th century France where a nobleman's letter was used to annul a marriage contract entirely. His words, meant only for one woman, ended up destroying his life with another. Talk about your texts backfiring. But wax could also preserve tenderness. Sometimes seals bore small symbols not of power, but of affection, tiny flowers, initials, or even playful shapes carved into makeshift stamps. A falcon for freedom, a rose for beauty, a star for eternal devotion. Holding one, you realize how even melted wax could speak louder than ink. As you picture lovers sealing their words with trembling hands, you can't help but think how fragile the system was. One careless crack, one curious servant, one rival with too much ambition, and everything spilled open. You lean back, imagining yourself in that world, your heart in your throat as the candle flame wavers across the scarlet blob of wax. Would you dare to press it closed, knowing your life might hinge on whether it stayed intact? The parchment cools under your touch, but the fear remains. The wax doesn't just seal words, it seals fates. You might even start to wonder, as many did centuries ago, whether the risk of writing love was worth it at all. And yet again and again, people pressed that seal and sent their hearts into the shadows. You pad quietly down a corridor that smells of tallow and cold stone and find the room where ink is born, the scriptorium, the closest thing the Middle Ages has to a server farm. Quills rest like little spears in a cup, knives for trimming nibs glint on the table, and bowls of dark fluid wait like midnight in ceramic. The monk at the far desk doesn't look up. He is draped in patience, shaving a feather to the perfect angle while you hover with a folded note heating your sleeve. You're not here for a saint's life tonight. You're here for a life raft. You've learned already that words can betray you. Remember that cherry red blob of wax from last night? And yet you persist. In a world where many cannot write their own names, monks and clerks become power adapters, converting emotion into ink. The monk clears his throat. You place a coin on the desk, the medieval way of saying this is hypothetical, which of course it isn't. A mainstream fact to steady your nerves. Literacy clusters in monasteries and chanceries, and the craft of letter writing is formalized in the ars dictaminis, the medieval art of composing letters, taught from Italy to France by the 13th century. Salutation, exordium, narration, petition, conclusion. The template hums beneath almost every neat paragraph. If you don't know the ritual, a scribe supplies the steps so your "I miss you" arrives wearing proper shoes. But the scriptorium is more than customer service. It's a crossroads. Monks copy charters in the morning and harmless receipts after dinner, and somewhere between, a private verse slips under the door. Sometimes the help is accidental. A lay brother carries a bundle to the next priory and doesn't ask what's inside. Sometimes it's deliberate. A clerk folds your note into the flyleaf of a prayer book bound for your beloved's household, a stowaway pressed flat beneath a litany of saints. You watch the monk pounce the parchment, yes, pounce, sprinkling ground cuttlefish bone so the surface drinks the ink, and the gesture feels suspiciously like seasoning a secret. The quill taps, a small heartbeat, and he copies the words you whisper. Praise that pretends to be piety, metaphors that would fool anyone not in on your joke. May the falcon find safe perch, you say, and he doesn't smile, though the corner of his mouth considers it. Line by careful line, he builds the house where your risk will sleep. Historians still argue whether monks and clerks actually encouraged clandestine love or simply became convenient couriers because everyone else was illiterate. The truth probably sits somewhere between a raised eyebrow and a discreet cough. You've met three kinds of scribes already: the stern gatekeeper, who won't spell your name without the abbot's leave; the tired professional, who will write anything so long as you pay and don't spill ale on the vellum; and the secret romantic, who files your metaphors without comment and slides the sand dish closer like a benediction. Quirky tidbit to make you grin. Manuscripts show tiny paw prints skittering across wet ink because cats were unofficial mice control in scriptoria. One poor scribe even left a note scolding a cat for an accident on his page. You picture a tabby trotting through your letter, smudging "ever yours" into "ever why," providing the Middle Ages with its first chaotic proofreader. If anyone asks later about the blur, you shrug and blame the feline copy editor. Works every time. The problem, of course, is delivery. Your monk can write, but he cannot teleport. Monastic houses maintain networks, messengers called nunci, lay brothers with pack horses, a string of hospices where travellers sleep on straw and trade news. You tuck your folded note into a psalter, right where, as the heart longs for streams of water, speaks of thirst which feels a little on the nose. The book is bound for a noble household 2 valleys away, and you gamble the recipient will open to the same page out of habit. Sometimes secrecy is just choreography. You ask whether the seal should be plain or impressed. The scribe remembers yesterday's wax and cocks an eyebrow. "Better none," he murmurs. If you want it to look like a bookmark someone forgot. You nod, and the two of you choreograph your small deception with the seriousness of high mass. Plan: the book rides in a leather satchel, the satchel reaches the steward hands it to your beloved, the beloved opens to the thirsty deer and finds your thirst disguised as devotion. Simple, hilariously risky, comfortingly normal. Ask yourself what all this does to conscience. You sit with that question as daylight thins. The rule of St. Benedict forbids private ownership. Even letters sent to a monk are to be read with the abbot's knowledge. Yet convents and priories hum with confidences tucked into the gaps of official life. In some places, confessors convert love notes into something like sanctioned speech. Copy this line as penance, they say, and the line just happens to mention a flower your beloved will recognize. Technically pious, conveniently personal. Your thoughts drift to the most famous clerical correspondence of longing. the letters of Heloise and Abelard. You trace a circle on the table with one finger, thinking of syllables that refuse to die. Historians still argue whether the surviving texts are verbatim or tidied by later editors who tried to press passion into theology. You don't need a verdict to know they breathe. What matters is that ink can cross walls that bodies cannot. The scribe finishes a copy of your message and dusts it again, the pounce falling like very small snow. He suggests a safeguard: add a final line in a different hand, a practiced way of disguising authorship. He shows you how to angle the quill so your letters lean a little left. You practice twice, and your name looks as if someone else whispered it. Medieval two-factor authentication, minus the annoying text message. It isn't all solemn subterfuge. At supper, the monks drink thin ale and swap weather gossip. One tells a joke about a wandering scholar who charges for love advice by the syllable. Another produces a wax tablet, reusable, the medieval scratch pad, and shows how messages can be scratched in, smoothed away, and written again. A shrewd messenger sometimes carries an innocent blank tablet openly, while a sliver of parchment hides under the binding of a book. Distraction is the best cloak. Night gathers, and with it the small fear that swells when you've done something irreversible. You walk the cloister, stone underfoot, stars snagging on the roof's edge. Somewhere in the guest house, a traveller snores. In the stable, a mule thumps its hoof, bored of being pure transportation. You think of your letter moving away from you step by step, turning into a story you no longer control. This is the tax you pay for secrecy. Once your words leave, they belong to the road. To steady yourself, you count the protections. The phrasing is coded. The seal is absent by design. The route is ordinary. The psalter is a common object. If intercepted, you can say you lent the book for pious use, your alibi stitched as neatly as your embroidery. You also take odd comfort in the economy of it. Parchment is expensive. Most people won't waste time exposing a trivial flirtation unless it profits them. Yes, that's the sort of thought that helps you sleep in a century without privacy settings. By the time the bell rings for Compline, you've learned how fragile and ingenious this network can be. You doubt anyone intended monasteries to double as post offices, but necessity is the most persuasive theologian. A letter passes from hand to hand, each link adding a layer of protection or peril. The scribe who wrote it for you returns to a saint's life, the ink from your confession drying in the same breath as a miracle about a talking fish. It's a strange world, and you are somehow exactly at home in it. Before you leave, the scribe slides something across the table, a narrow slip with a few lines in a cipher of reversed letters. For practice, he says, and the softness in his voice surprises you. Maybe he sees the ache you carry like a candle cupped against wind. Maybe he's just invested in good penmanship. Either way, your fingers close around the slip as if it were warm. You step into the corridor, past the choir where tomorrow's chant already sleeps in neat square notes. Above you, the roof timbers creak like old ships. Ahead, the door waits, iron strapwork, cool under your palm. You breathe once, twice, and step into night air that tastes of wood smoke and damp leaves. Somewhere a boy runs across a bridge with your second letter. Somewhere a psalter rides in a satchel with your first. And somewhere a heart you know by its rhythm turns a page. If wax was a lock in section 2, the scribe is your locksmith here, discreet, precise, and a little amused. You tug your cloak tighter. You are deeper in than you meant to be, but you find yourself smiling anyway. Secrets teach you to walk softly and to hope loudly. You do both as you disappear into the dark. You walk further into this world of whispers, and the letters in your hand begin to glow with a strange sort of code. At first glance, it's nothing more than chatter about gardens, falcons, and roses, but you soon learn that medieval lovers practically built a whole botanical dictionary of desire. You trace your finger along the parchment and realize you're reading what looks like a hunting manual, yet behind every word lurks something warmer, riskier, and very much forbidden. A mainstream fact to anchor you, allegory and metaphor, were the lifeblood of medieval literature. From troubadour songs in southern France to the courtly romances of northern Europe, writers cloaked passion in symbols. A hawk yearning to land wasn't just a hawk, it was the lover himself, restless, desperate, circling in the air. A rose garden wasn't just horticulture, it was the beloved's body, sweet and dangerous at once. If your husband or wife peeked over your shoulder, they might think you were reading about falconry or pruning hedges. Only the intended reader would recognize the pulse beneath the petals. And then comes the quirky tidbit. Lovers didn't just use flowers as metaphors. They sometimes sent dried ones inside their letters. A pressed violet, a sprig of rosemary, or even a leaf dusted with perfume could say far more than ink. Imagine someone today sending you a text that smells faintly of lavender. Hard to ignore, isn't it? Some letters even instructed the recipient to burn or boil the plant enclosed, turning the token into a tiny ritual of remembrance. Romance? Meet DIY herbalism. Of course, historians still argue whether these codes were understood universally or if couples invented their own symbols in private. Was a falcon always a man, or could it mean freedom, longing, or even rebellion, depending on the context? One scholar points out that the Roman de la Rose, that massive allegorical poem, flooded medieval culture with garden imagery so thoroughly that half the metaphors may have been borrowed clichés. Others argue that personal letters reveal enough quirky variations to prove each pair of lovers developed their own secret key. Either way, you're left puzzling over every blossom and bird like a medieval cryptographer with a very nosy smile. You unfold one letter more carefully. When the orchard is in bloom, my heart soars. That's the line. Innocent enough, but in context, orchard means her body, bloom means desire, and soaring heart. But you can probably guess. A modern emoji would cut to the chase, but medieval lovers preferred to cloak their fire in leaves and feathers. Perhaps it made the risk easier to bear. If caught, you could still claim innocence. Picture yourself trying to read between the lines. You hold a page written in French but bristling with Latin insertions, deliberately mixing languages to confuse the casual snooper. Your eyes scan past rose and falcon, then stumble upon a little doodle in the margin, a heart pierced by an arrow scrawled hastily. Suddenly the disguise is thin as parchment. The writer couldn't resist revealing himself. That little sketch is louder than the falcon, louder than the orchard, louder than the whole page. The brilliance of metaphor was its flexibility. A lover could write, "The hunt tires me, but the reward is worth the chase." To a noble household it sounded like sport. To the intended woman it was a playful nudge that he was exhausted but still dreaming of her embrace. And sometimes the letters spiraled into riddles so complex even the modern scholar can't decode them. It's a bit like reading old inside jokes without knowing the punchline. You're left guessing at what was once obvious to two smitten souls. The candle sputters as you imagine two lovers, each locked in separate households, holding on to these letters like lifelines. Words about vines twisting together, falcons stooping, roses opening at dawn. Every metaphor dripping with tension. What strikes you is the patience. Today, if someone doesn't reply in an hour, you panic. In the Middle Ages, you might wait weeks for an answer, all the while replaying every falcon and rose in your head until it blurred into obsession. As you breathe, you realize how heavy these words could be. A metaphor wasn't just decoration, it was camouflage, safety net, secret handshake. It was also a burden because if someone else cracked the code, your secret was laid bare. Husbands, wives, confessors, even political enemies could use your orchard and falcon against you. Love letters could turn from perfume to poison in an instant. Still, you smile at the cleverness. In a world without emojis, without private messages, without even a lock on your door, lovers invented a whole parallel language to say what could not be spoken. And as you fold the parchment again, you know the next risk is not in the ink itself, but in how that fragile paper makes its way across the miles. You tuck the folded parchment into your sleeve, and suddenly the most pressing question isn't what you wrote, but how on earth you'll get it delivered. You glance at the candle, then at the drafty window, and it hits you. Sending this letter is like sending a paper airplane across a battlefield. One wrong move, and you've given your enemies ammunition and your beloved nothing but heartache. In the Middle Ages, delivery was always the most fragile step. No postal service, no mailboxes, no cheerful couriers in bright uniforms. Instead, there were servants, pilgrims, peddlers, scribes, and occasionally a very trustworthy shepherd who happened to be walking in the right direction. A mainstream fact by the 13th century, royal households and major monasteries had their own courier networks, often carrying official charters and papal bulls. But for private citizens, especially lovers, delivery relied on improvisation. Imagine slipping a letter to a maid who already carries your trays, hoping her loyalty is worth more than a bribe from someone else. Or perhaps you trust a wandering minstrel, his lute case rattling with more secrets than strings. Sometimes pilgrims were the safest choice. After all, who would suspect someone bound for Santiago de Compostela of smuggling a little romance along the way? But here's a quirky tidbit. Some lovers used falconers as go-betweens, hiding tiny folded notes in the leather pouches attached to the birds' jesses. Yes, falconry wasn't only for showing off your status in the hunt, it could double as a medieval FedEx with wings. Historians still argue whether this was widespread practice or just legend embroidered by later storytellers, but the image of a goshawk ferrying whispered confessions across castle walls is irresistible. You picture the dangers. A servant could read your words, or worse, hand them to the wrong person. A rival suitor might intercept the message, tuck it into his own belt, and confront you later with a smug smile. And then there were the ultimate snoops, royal agents who deliberately opened and copied correspondence. Entire treason trials hinged on letters that were never meant to be seen. For a simple love note, the stakes were still enormous. Exposure meant shame, punishment, sometimes even annulment. Still, human beings can be clever. Lovers learned to disguise letters as harmless accounts, lists of sheep, shipments of grain, even instructions for brewing ale. A recipe might include a pinch of rosemary for memory of you, or a dash of cloves for longing. To anyone else, it was kitchen chatter. To the recipient, it was the sweetest code imaginable. The funniest part? Sometimes the messenger was the very person a husband or wife thought they could trust least. Imagine a suspicious husband assigning his page boy to follow his wife's every move, only for that page boy to become the secret courier delivering her love notes. Medieval life overflowed with irony, and this was one of its cheekiest. You trace the path of one such letter in your mind. It leaves your trembling hand, slips into the pocket of a servant, hides under bread in a market basket, passes between fingers at a gatehouse, and finally lands in the lap of the one who was waiting, hoping, aching. That moment, the parchment crinkling open, the eyes racing across the ink, is worth every risk. Historians still argue whether these clandestine deliveries happened more often in noble courts, where literacy was higher, or among townsfolk where letters were rarer but no less passionate. Some insist that most letters were written for performance, to show wit and rhetorical skill. Others see in the smudges the hurried handwriting and the scorched wax the fingerprints of real, desperate longing. The candle sputters lower as you imagine a lover, sleepless, pacing by the door and listening for the faint jingle of spurs, the shuffle of boots, the knock that might carry salvation. You know the thrill of anticipation yourself, that nervous flicker in the chest, that question of whether the words made it through the labyrinth unscathed. You slip your imaginary letter into a satchel and hand it to a pilgrim, praying he treats it as sacred cargo. As he disappears into the night, you realize the truth. Once your words leave your hand, they belong to fortune. Sometimes they arrive safely, sometimes they vanish forever, and sometimes they return in the grip of the very person you feared most. Delivery was never just about distance. It was about gambling your heart against the odds. The letter leaves your hands and you breathe a little easier, until you remember something important. Even the highest walls, the strictest guards, the most iron-bound rules of propriety couldn't stop kings and queens themselves from playing the very same game. If love letters were dangerous for commoners, they were downright explosive for royals. You pause, holding in your mind a vision of a queen's chamber, heavy curtains, carved bedposts, guards stationed at the door. And yet, beneath the canopy, she reaches for a folded slip of parchment as though it were more precious than her crown. A mainstream fact for grounding. Many royal figures left behind troves of personal letters that reveal private passions, sometimes genuine, sometimes calculated. Think of Henry VIII's ardent notes to Anne Boleyn, written in French to impress her, or Eleanor of Aquitaine's rumoured correspondence during her long political entanglements. In courts where alliances were sealed with marriages of convenience, love letters became both lifelines and political liabilities. The risk was immense. A royal affair wasn't just scandalous, it could tilt entire kingdoms. One intercepted letter could give a rival faction leverage, spark an annulment, or shift foreign policy. And yet passion is a stubborn tide. Kings with all the power in the world still longed for written proof of devotion. Queens, caught between dynastic duty and private desire, still risked scribbling their hearts onto parchment. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some monarchs, paranoid about interception, wrote their love letters in their own hand instead of dictating to clerks, a rare sight in a world where rulers usually let scribes do the writing. The uneven scrawl of Henry VIII's French letters shows just how determined he was to make them personal. He even doodled little hearts and declarations of eternal loyalty. Imagine, the man who tore England away from Rome was also a king who couldn't resist drawing lovesick sketches. Historians still argue whether these royal letters always represent true affection or whether they were sometimes staged, part of political theatre. Was Mary, Queen of Scots, truly guilty of plotting with Bothwell, as English authorities claimed, or were her so-called casket letters forged to justify her downfall? Even now scholars debate the authenticity of those damning notes, their ink as controversial today as it was in the 16th century. Picture the courtier who risks everything to carry such a letter across palace halls. One slip, one wrong turn, and the affair is no longer private, it's treason. A servant caught with royal correspondence could be tortured for answers. Yet somehow letters still moved, slipped through hidden passages, concealed in prayer books or tucked into gloves. You smile at the irony. Royal marriages were often arranged to cement alliances, to merge lands and armies, but the real fuel of those unions sometimes burned outside the marriage bed. Love letters, fragile, flammable, reckless, showed where the human heart strayed beyond treaties. One queen, isolated and surrounded by hostile courtiers, might unfold a letter late at night and press it to her lips. A king, weary of council meetings, might keep a folded slip in his sleeve like a talisman. The most powerful people in Europe reduced to exactly the same ritual as a servant girl or a farmer's son, clutching parchment as though it were flesh. The candlelight flickers as you realize something soothing and startling. No matter the crown, the wealth, the pomp, love letters leveled everyone. They turned kings into poets, queens into conspirators, and dynasties into delicate paper chains. You tuck this thought into your heart, knowing the ink of royalty carried both the perfume of romance and the smoke of danger. The letters of monarchs remind you that secrecy was never just for the powerless. It was a game played by everyone, even those who ruled. And like every game in the Middle Ages, the stakes were higher than life itself. You leave the echoing halls of royalty behind and step into a narrower street, one that smells of hearth smoke, wool, and onion broth. Here, in the bustle of market towns and small villages, love letters are rarer but no less fierce. Quills may be scarcer, parchment more expensive, and literacy less common, but passion doesn't wait for privilege. A mainstream fact sets the stage. By the late Middle Ages, literacy among townsfolk and merchants had begun to grow, especially in Italy, France, and the Low Countries. Not every cobbler or brewer could write, but many could hire someone who could. Letters weren't the exclusive toys of nobles. Guild members, apprentices, even shepherds found ways to put feelings into words. And when paper became cheaper after its introduction from Islamic Spain, the habit spread even further. Imagine a young merchant in Florence, perched over a candle with ink-stained fingers, stumbling through Latin phrases he half remembers from school. His words aren't elegant, but they are raw. I think of you when the market bells toll. No falcons or roses, just the blunt honesty of someone who doesn't have time for metaphor because the wool shipments are late again. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some surviving letters from commoners include practical gifts tucked inside, lockets of hair, scraps of ribbon, even coins. One miller's daughter folded her handkerchief around a note, the stitches of her embroidery spelling out his initials. Another letter was smeared with flour because the writer had no patience to wash before sealing it up. These tiny accidents, crumbs, stains, smudges, make the words feel less like artifacts and more like the size of real people. Historians still argue whether love letters among commoners were truly private or whether families were often in on the secret. Some evidence suggests that households were surprisingly complicit, parents turning a blind eye, siblings acting as couriers. Other scholars argue the opposite, that clandestine notes were doubly risky among townsfolk, where gossip was tighter and reputations more fragile. The truth, like flour on the page, smudges in every direction. You smile, picturing a young apprentice carving a makeshift stylus and scratching his message onto a wax tablet because paper was too dear. He erases and rewrites until he's satisfied, then transfers the message to parchment at the tavern, where a literate friend helps him spell the trickier words. His beloved, perhaps a brewer's daughter, receives the folded parchment hidden inside a sack of hops. She blushes, pretends it's nothing, then tucks it into her bodice, where it will beat against her ribs all day. There's a tenderness in these humble exchanges that even royalty couldn't touch. A noble might have had gilded ink and perfumed paper, but a miller's son only had his clumsy scrawl. And somehow, that clumsiness feels more enduring. It's harder to fake sincerity when your handwriting looks like a chicken trying to dance across the page. Still, danger loomed even here. A jealous rival could expose a note, a gossiping neighbour could recognize the handwriting, and the parish priest could scold you from the pulpit. But for every risk there was joy, the thrill of slipping a folded paper across a market stall, the heartbeat that raced when someone returned your note with a shy smile. The street outside your window grows quieter, as though the townsfolk have gone to bed, their letters tucked under pillows. You realize that in every class, from king to apprentice, love letters weren't about eloquence or safety. They were about reaching across distance, carving a tunnel through silence, and trusting a fragile scrap of parchment to hold what hearts dared not speak aloud. You close your eyes and let the noise of the market fade, the parchment crinkling softly in your hand. Somewhere, a merchant boy stumbles over Latin, somewhere a girl stitches initials into a ribbon, and somewhere words scratch their way into the night air like sparks from a smith's hammer. You step out of the marketplace, leaving behind the wool dust and ale fumes, and you wander toward quieter cloisters. Here the silence hums differently, not with the bargaining of merchants, but with the rustle of habits and the murmur of psalms. And yet within these stone walls dedicated to chastity and prayer, love letters found their way in like ivy through a cracked window. A mainstream fact first, though priests and nuns took vows of celibacy, history is dotted with cases where those vows bent under human longing. From the 12th century onwards, church authorities complained, sometimes bitterly, that clerics and religious were exchanging letters with friends of the opposite sex. Entire councils were convened to reinforce the ban, proof that the problem was widespread enough to be a serious concern. Picture a young nun in a convent scriptorium writing a devotional meditation that looks pious on the surface but drips with longing if you know how to read between the lines. She addresses Christ as "my beloved," yes, but she also tucks a folded scrap inside the binding of her manuscript, a message meant for a very flesh and blood priest outside the convent walls. The words blur together. Love divine, love forbidden, love human. Which love is which? That question isn't just yours. Historians still argue whether many of these so-called mystical writings reflect spiritual devotion only, or if they sometimes doubled as cover for more earthly affections. Here's your quirky tidbit. In some places, confessors were suspected of slipping notes to penitents under the guise of spiritual instruction. Imagine kneeling in a dark confessional, whispering sins, only to feel a folded scrap pressed into your palm as penance. The line between sacrament and flirtation blurred as dangerously as the ink on vellum. And yes, bishops wrote stern warnings about this exact practice. You picture the delivery routes. Convents received food, clothing, and letters from patrons. A basket of bread could easily conceal a folded slip. A visiting friar might tuck a note into the sleeve of his habit. The wide cloth folds a perfect hiding place. A convent window, barred but not impassable, could allow for a letter tied to a stone, tossed across with both hope and trembling. The risk? Catastrophic. A discovered letter between a nun and a priest could end careers, reputations, even lives. Some were punished by exile, others by confinement, and in notorious cases entire convents were investigated because of one intercepted scrap of parchment. And yet the letters persisted. Think of Heloisa and Abelard again. Their letters are the most famous of all clerical romances, filled with passion so raw that centuries later they still sing. You trail your finger across their lines. God knows I never sought anything in you but yourself. The words feel almost too modern, too desperate, to have been written in an age of rigid vows, and yet they were. Historians debate whether these letters are unique or part of a much larger, quieter pattern. Were Heloise and Abelard exceptional, or simply the most unfortunate pair whose letters were preserved instead of destroyed? The debate lingers like incense in a chapel, impossible to clear completely. You imagine for a moment being the scribe who stumbles upon such a letter while copying a psalm. Do you slip it back into the folds and pretend you never saw it? Or do you deliver it to the abbess, knowing it could ruin a sister forever? That choice, the pull between compassion and duty, was one every set of eyes faced when ink met parchment in forbidden ways. And yet, for all the danger, the letters themselves often glow with tenderness. A nun writing about longing compares her heart to a locked cell, the key held by her beloved. A priest, caught in the tension of vows, calls himself your servant in both soul and body, a phrase that must have burned like hot wax. You fold the parchment in your hand and hear the bells toll for vespers. The sound shakes the rafters, steady, solemn, but it cannot drown out the soft rustle of letters sliding across thresholds. Behind every prayer, behind every chant, behind every candle flame, there is the murmur of humanity, stubborn and unquenchable. You leave the cloistered hush of convent walls and step into a field alive with trumpets and dust. It's tournament day, colourful banners ripple in the wind, horses snort and paw the ground, and young squires dash about tightening straps and polishing armour. To the crowd it's all spectacle, knights crashing into one another for honour, for glory, for the thrill of a splintering lance. But if you look closer, you see the quietest exchanges happen, not in the lists, but in the shadows just beyond. A mainstream fact first, tournaments in the high Middle Ages weren't just sporting events, they were vast social gatherings where nobles from distant lands mingled. Ladies displayed their finery, families arranged marriages, and knights sought patrons. Courtly love, that ritualized system of devotion, often played out here most visibly. A knight might dedicate his performance in the joust to a lady, wearing her colours pinned to his sleeve. Behind the pageantry, love letters moved like contraband, folded tight and pressed into eager hands. Imagine it, a knight, his armour creaking as he bows before his chosen lady, slipping a folded parchment into her glove as she ties her token around his arm. The crowd sees romance, but the letter itself, hidden inside the glove, is the true confession, delivered in public, hidden in plain sight. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. Some ladies actually sewed tiny silk pouches inside their sleeves to hold notes or tokens from admirers. One surviving account mentions a noblewoman fainting during a tournament, her sleeve torn open in the commotion, revealing not one, but 3 secret letters tucked away. Imagine the gossip that spilled faster than the wine that day. Historians still argue whether these tournaments were genuine hotbeds of romance or carefully choreographed performances of love with little private passion behind them. Were the letters heartfelt, or were they theatrical gestures, part of the ritualized language of courtly devotion? Either way, the paper trail is undeniable. What looks like chivalry from the outside often concealed whispers, much sharper than any lance. You walk behind the tournament stands and you see messengers weaving through the crowd, carrying not just errands for knights, but slips of parchment between ladies' maids and eager squires. Each pass of a glove, each exchange of a token, is a dance of coded signals. The joust is merely the stage. The true theatre is in the margins. The risks, of course, were enormous. A jealous husband or rival could intercept a note. An ambitious squire might betray a secret to earn favour. And yet the thrill of secrecy only heightened the passion. To write a love letter was daring. To pass it during a tournament, in full view of nobles and clergy alike, was practically taunting fate. You can almost hear the whispers, "Meet me at the chapel door at dusk. Do not trust the steward, he watches me. I remain your prisoner, bound by your ribbon." Words that look like poetry, but cut sharper than steel if discovered. And there is humour here, too. One knight, too nervous to write his own letter, borrowed a friend's eloquence, only to discover his lady fell for the ghostwriter instead. Another, illiterate but determined, sent a crude drawing of himself holding a heart the size of a turnip. You can imagine her face when she unfolded that masterpiece, part laughter, part tenderness, maybe a touch of pity. The dust of the joust swirls as the trumpets blare again. You realize that in the clash of lances the real collisions were happening on parchment. The lists ended in splinters, but the letters, folded into sleeves, hidden in gloves, stitched into ribbons, carried consequences long after the cheering stopped. You close your eyes and hear the rattle of armor, the rustle of silk, the scratch of quills that prepared for this very day. You drift on the thought that in medieval life, tournaments weren't just about who unseated whom. They were about who dared to write, who dared to read, and who dared to risk everything with ink and parchment while the crowd applauded the noise of lances. You wander away from the tournament field, the cheers still echoing behind you, and find yourself in a dim chamber where secrets sit heavier than gold. Here, the love letters don't flutter as tokens of romance. They thud onto tables as bargaining chips. In the Middle Ages, a folded scrap of parchment could be more powerful than a sword if discovered in the right or wrong hands. A mainstream fact grounds you. In medieval courts, evidence of adultery or scandal often came in the form of intercepted letters. Canon law courts, which handled cases of marriage, annulment, and moral offences, sometimes treated personal correspondence as admissible proof. If a husband suspected his wife of infidelity, he might hire servants to spy and snatch her notes. Families, too, wielded letters to force unwanted marriages to collapse, or to cement alliances by exposing rivals. You picture it. A letter meant to be a gentle confession becomes a dagger in the wrong hands. A jealous husband slams it onto the table before the bishop. The bishop squints at the ink, clears his throat, and the room grows icy. A lady's poetic falcon longs to perch upon your hand, suddenly reads like open treason against her marriage vows. Quirky tidbit. One 14th century case records a father intercepting his daughter's love notes, then using them as leverage to pressure her suitor into marrying her with a larger dowry. The poor man caved not out of devotion, but because the letters, if revealed, would ruin her honour entirely. Romance transformed overnight into negotiation, with parchment as currency. Historians still argue whether these episodes were common practice or exceptional scandals. Some claim love letters were routinely weaponized in family politics. Others insist most letters were destroyed long before enemies could exploit them, and only the rare disasters survive in court records. Either way, the surviving scraps remind you that medieval romance was never entirely private. It was always a negotiation with eyes watching from the shadows. You glance again at one of these letters, and suddenly every affectionate phrase reads differently. "I am your prisoner" isn't sweet, it's incriminating. "Meet me by the orchard" isn't playful, it's dangerous. You realize how fragile the line was between affection and evidence. What lovers saw as tenderness, others saw as leverage. There's a cruel irony in it. Letters were meant to preserve fleeting feelings, but their permanence often doomed those very feelings. Spoken words vanished into the air. Written words lingered, waiting to betray. Imagine the schemes: a scheming brother secretly pocketing a rival's letter, a lady-in-waiting bribed to pass notes to her mistress's husband, even kings gathering compromising correspondence to blackmail nobles into loyalty. The medieval world was built on networks of trust and betrayal, and love letters often slipped from one category to the other. And yet, even in their most incriminating form, these letters pulse with life. They reveal human beings too stubborn to silence themselves, too desperate not to reach across the chasms imposed by law, family, or faith. They gambled their reputations and futures on folded parchment. Some lost spectacularly, others won marriages, alliances, or at least a few sweet nights of escape. You fold the imagined letter back into its envelope, your fingers trembling as though someone might burst in at any moment. You think of how, in medieval life, the boundary between intimacy and exposure was razor thin. Ink was both weapon and wound, shield and shackle. As you set the parchment down, you feel the weight of all those who gambled their hearts and learned too late that their words could outlive them, and sometimes undo them. The silence around you thickens, as if the walls themselves are whispering. Choose your words carefully. They may not stay yours for long. The chamber grows colder as you shuffle through another stack of parchment. And this one feels different, messier, blotched, and smudged with hurried ink. These aren't the polished declarations of knights or the calculated schemes of noble families. These are raw, almost painful pages where jealousy stains the margins as dark as the ink itself. A mainstream fact for grounding: love letters in the Middle Ages didn't always overflow with sweetness. Just as often they carried notes of doubt, suspicion, or bitterness. Surviving examples include accusations of betrayal, pleas for reassurance, or even outright anger. In an age when relationships were constrained by distance and silence, every delay in receiving a reply could send a lover spiraling into suspicion. You hold one such letter and read a line. "Why do you not answer when I am your servant and bound only to you?" The ink runs heavy here, as though the quill was pressed too hard, breaking under the writer's desperation. You can almost see him pacing, dipping his pen again and again, his frustration seeping into every blot. Quirky tidbit: in some cases, jealousy was so overwhelming that writers literally scratched out their own words mid-sentence, leaving ghostly traces on the parchment. Scholars studying these letters under raking light have found entire erased phrases like, "I know you love another," scraped away with a knife. The parchment, of course, remembers everything. So you end up reading not just what was written, but what was unsaid. Historians still argue whether these confessional outbursts represent authentic passion or whether they were part of the ritual of courtly love in which jealousy was considered proof of devotion. Some believe these letters revealed genuine turmoil. Others argue the theatrics were just another way to prove fidelity, because in medieval logic, if you weren't jealous, you weren't in love. You can't help but smile at the absurdity, even as it feels strangely familiar. Modern lovers still reread text messages a dozen times, searching for hidden meanings. Medieval lovers did the same, except their "seen at 2:14 p.m. was the silence of a messenger who never returned. You imagine one woman reading a jealous note by candlelight, sighing as she folds it shut, amused but a little flattered. Another man might tremble at the sight of an angry hand, worrying that his mistress was slipping away to another night. And yet, beneath the frustration, these letters often ended with desperate pleas. "Do not abandon me. I am lost without your word." The candle in your hand flickers, and you realize jealousy inked itself into permanence. Once confessed on parchment, It became evidence of vulnerability, of need. No amount of scraping could ever truly erase the emotion that bled into the fibers. It's funny, these letters, blotched and imperfect, feel more alive than the neatest declarations of love. They show lovers not as untouchable figures in tapestries, but as people caught in the same storms of suspicion you've probably felt yourself. And in their imperfection they are painfully, wonderfully human. You set the smudged page down, your own fingers darkened by phantom ink, and you feel the restless pulse of hearts long gone. In every blot, in every erased line, in every desperate flourish, you hear the same whisper. Love me, reassure me, don't let me vanish into silence. You shuffle through the next pile of parchment, and suddenly the air is heavy with fragrance. At first you think it's your imagination, but then you remember some medieval letters weren't just read, they were smelled. Lovers went beyond ink and words, adding touches that lingered long after the message was delivered. A mainstream fact first, perfumes in the Middle Ages weren't bottled sprays like today. They came from herbs, oils, and crushed petals, often carried in pomanders or sachets. Wealthy households distilled roses, violets, and lavender, while humbler folk used rosemary or thyme. And yes, lovers sometimes rubbed these scents into parchment, so the fragrance would travel with the words. A folded note could release the smell of a garden when opened, a private sensory world blooming in the reader's hands. You hold one such letter in your mind. As it opens, the faint perfume rises, maybe rose, maybe myrtle. The smell mingles with wax and old parchment until it feels almost alive. Imagine being a lonely night miles away, unfolding a letter and suddenly inhaling the same scent your beloved wore at a feast weeks earlier. The parchment becomes her presence. The fragrance outlasts memory. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some letters even enclosed strands of hair, ribbons, or tiny pressed flowers. One surviving medieval example contained a lock of blonde hair carefully tied with thread so that the beloved could literally run their fingers through it. Another bore faint lip marks where someone had pressed a kiss onto the page, like the world's earliest lipstick print. You can almost hear the scholar in the archives sighing as they spot it under the microscope, proof that human tenderness survives for centuries, faint but stubborn. Historians still argue whether these scented and adorned letters were widespread or rare luxuries. Was it common for lovers to sprinkle rosewater on parchment, or were such indulgences limited to wealthy courts? Some point to the fragile survival of perfumed notes as evidence they were treasured keepsakes. Others suspect most scents evaporated long ago, leaving only faint descriptions in poetry. You smile at the thought of a young noblewoman carefully dabbing her letter with lavender water, then panicking that she used too much, or a nervous suitor slipping a tiny sachet of cloves into a folded note, hoping it wouldn't crumble to dust before it arrived. The humour is timeless. Romance always flirts with a little clumsiness. And then there's the power of touch. Imagine running your thumb over a ribbon tied around a folded page, the same ribbon your beloved once wore. In an age where many lovers couldn't risk even holding hands in public, such tokens carried intimacy beyond words. A scented letter wasn't just read, it was inhaled, held, touched, cherished in silence. The room around you seems to soften as you think about it. These weren't just letters, they were multi-sensory love packages, medieval care parcels. In their fragrance, their pressed petals, their stray hairs, they carried pieces of the sender's body and soul. You lean back and let the thought drift. Somewhere, centuries ago, a knight lifted a perfumed parchment to his face and closed his eyes. Somewhere, a woman unfolded a note and caught the faint trace of rosemary her beloved had tucked between the lines. And here you sit now, centuries later, catching those same whispers, faint as fragrance, but still, impossibly, alive. You smooth out another parchment, and this one doesn't read like ordinary prose at all. The lines are stacked neatly, the rhythm deliberate, the words rhyming softly in Latin and French. This is no simple letter, it's poetry disguised as correspondence, the artful mask that allowed desire to pass unnoticed through prying eyes, a mainstream fact to steady you. By the 12th and 13th centuries, the ars dictaminis, the art of letter writing, often blurred into the art of verse. Courtly culture adored poetry, and nobles prided themselves on composing or commissioning rhyme declarations of love. Troubadours in southern France, minnesingers in Germany, and poets in Italy all shaped a culture where love letters and lyric poetry were almost interchangeable. Some letters survive that are indistinguishable from songs, their couplets flowing as if meant to be sung by a lute. You read one aloud in your mind. In gardens where the roses sleep, your name is all the vows I keep. Though silence binds my lips each day, my heart writes letters anyway. The rhymes feel simple, almost childlike, but you know they carried meanings that throbbed beneath the surface. A husband might read them as harmless verse. A beloved, however, would recognize the hidden geography of desire. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some medieval couples used acrostics, where the first letter of each line spelled out a name or a message. Scholars have uncovered verses where vertically the lines reveal amor, or even the beloved's initials. A clever poet could cloak devotion in poetry that looked general, but contained a personal secret key. It was medieval encryption with a flourish of quills. Historians still argue whether these poetic letters were genuine expressions of love or stylized performances. Were they truly heartfelt, or were lovers simply imitating fashionable conventions of courtly love? Some scholars insist that the recurring metaphors of roses and nightingales were clichés borrowed from popular songs. Others argue that within these clichés, personal quirks, like sudden references to a crooked smile or a unique garment, reveal authentic intimacy. You imagine the delivery of folded parchment, its verses read aloud by a minstrel at a feast, everyone laughing at the rhymes, while only two people in the hall know the poem is secretly their conversation. It's both public and private at once, a dangerous thrill hidden in rhyme. Think of the effort, too. Composing poetry wasn't easy, especially for someone not trained in letters. Lovers often paid professional scribes or poets to craft verses on their behalf. This sometimes led to amusing disasters. One man accidentally reused a poem that his beloved had already heard from another admirer. It's the medieval version of copy-pasting the wrong love song into a text message. Yet even through the clichés, the verses pulse with yearning. Poetry gave lovers cover, but it also gave them wings. A simple line, "The falcon stoops to your hand," could carry double meanings, triple meanings, even endless echoes across the page. You set the parchment down and realize something. Love letters weren't just about content, they were about performance. They were rehearsals of feeling, polished masks that revealed as much as they concealed. Every rhyme was a risk, every verse a gamble, and yet lovers kept writing. They believed poetry could outwit suspicion, or at least buy them enough beauty to make the risk worthwhile. You close your eyes, hearing faint rhymes still floating in the candlelight. Somewhere, a knight tries to rhyme rose with prose and fails miserably. Somewhere, a lady reads an acrostic and gasps when she sees her name spelled out, hidden like a jewel. And somewhere, even now, you can feel those rhymes working their quiet magic, centuries after they were whispered into the night. The rhymes still hum in your ears as you step into a grand hall, its rafters heavy with smoke and laughter. Tapestries ripple on the walls, goblets clink on long oak tables, and yet at the far end sits something stranger than a banquet, a tribunal. But not the grim kind where judges wear black hoods and dole out punishments. This is a court of love. A mainstream fact to anchor you. In 12th century France, noblewomen, especially Eleanor of Aquitaine and her daughter Marie of Champagne, presided over what chroniclers called courts of love. These weren't legal courts with jails and fines, but playful salons where noblemen and women debated questions of romance, fidelity, and the rules of courtly love. Letters and poems were often presented as evidence in these theatrical proceedings. Did this knight's rhyme prove true devotion? Did this lady's reply show cruelty or mercy? The gatherings blended philosophy, literature, and a fair bit of gossip. You picture a lady sitting on a carved chair, her gown pooling around her like a tide of silk. She holds a folded parchment and reads aloud, "When the falcon stoops, my soul falls too." The hall murmurs. A knight, red-faced, shifts uncomfortably while his rival smirks. The ladies confer, nodding gravely as though they were settling a dispute about land instead of longing. Here's your quirky tidbit. Records survive of these courts issuing tongue-in-cheek verdicts. One decision ruled that love could not exist in marriage because marriage was about duty, not choice. Another declared that a woman could not love two men at once, but a man, amusingly, could love two women, though only if neither objected. Imagine standing before such a jury with your letter as evidence, your heart's ink dissected like a chicken at market. Historians still argue whether these courts were real social institutions or literary inventions. Some scholars see them as elaborate parties where witty nobles acted out roles more theatre than law. Others argue they had genuine influence on how aristocrats understood love, shaping behaviour and even relationships. Either way, the letters read aloud in these halls became performances, their private intimacy transformed into public spectacle. You can't help but laugh at the absurdity. Imagine today if your private texts were read aloud at a dinner party and judged for sincerity. He used 3 heart emojis, but noticed no exclamation point. Clearly not true devotion. Medieval nobles weren't so different. They just used falcons and roses instead of emojis and gifs. Yet for all the humour, the stakes could feel real. A verdict from the Queen of Love could sway reputations, strengthen or weaken alliances, and set tongues wagging for months. A flattering ruling might elevate a knight's honour. A harsh one could brand him a fool. Letters were not only hearts on parchment, they became chess pieces in a game of wit and status. The hall grows quieter in your imagination as the lady judge folds the parchment closed. She announces her decision with solemn flair, and the crowd erupts in applause or laughter. The knight bows, humbled, while his beloved glances away with a carefully measured smile. The letter, once a whisper, has now been weighed and judged in the court of public opinion. You slip back into the shadows, realizing how fragile the line was between intimacy and display. A letter written in secret could, within days, become theatre for an entire court. And perhaps that was part of the thrill, knowing that what you wrote in a trembling hand might echo, distorted or magnified through halls of power. The candle in your mind sputters, but the echoes of laughter linger. You realize that medieval love was never only private, it was also performance, debate, and sometimes comedy. And yet beneath all the games, the letters still carried something real. The raw spark of longing, waiting to ignite in a world that couldn't quite decide whether to punish it or celebrate it. The laughter of that court of love still rings in your ears when you stumble into a different kind of chamber, one where the mood is darker, quieter, and altogether more dangerous. Here, the love letter isn't a game or a witty poem read aloud before amused noblewomen. It's a liability, a fuse waiting to burn. This is the space where affairs unravel, where private words spill into the open and change lives forever. A mainstream fact first. Throughout the late Middle Ages, private correspondence was often used as hard evidence in annulment trials, inheritance disputes, or scandals involving nobility. Unlike rumours or accusations, a letter was something tangible, a scrap of parchment, ink dried into permanence. Courts and councils treated these words as near irrefutable proof of guilt or betrayal. The Church especially valued written evidence. Canon lawyers loved to wave incriminating letters like smoking guns before bishops and judges. You picture it vividly, a folded parchment snatched by a suspicious husband, slammed onto the table before the entire household. His face burns red, his hand trembles with rage, and he hisses, "Explain this!" The wife, pale, stammers. But the ink is there, betraying her no matter what she says. Words meant to whisper affection now shout treason against her vows. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some nobles were so paranoid about being exposed that they ordered their lovers to eat the letter immediately after reading it. Yes, literally chew and swallow parchment. One Italian account describes a woman caught in the act of biting a note into shreds when her husband burst into the room. She claimed it was merely spiced paper for the stomach. No one believed her. Historians still argue whether most exposed affairs were truly revealed by letters or whether those letters were sometimes forged. One infamous case in 15th century Burgundy involved accusations that a duchess had written compromising notes to a courtier. Some scholars believe the letters were authentic, others suspect they were manufactured by political enemies. The debate remains unresolved, reminding you that in medieval Europe, ink could be just as treacherous as gossip. You imagine the emotional fallout: a betrayed husband clutching a page like a dagger, servants whispering in corridors, a family reputation unraveling with every retelling. Even when letters weren't dragged into court, they could explode inside households. A crumpled note discovered under a pillow, a page left too carelessly in a chest, an intercepted delivery, all could spark nights of shouting, tears, or icy silence. Think, too, of the danger for messengers. Some servants caught ferrying illicit letters were beaten, dismissed, or worse. There are records of messengers being tortured to reveal who had hired them. The risk wasn't limited to the writers and readers. Even the go-betweens paid the price when secrets crumbled. And yet, amid all this peril, lovers still wrote. They couldn't stop themselves. Words, once loosed, had a life of their own. To write was to gamble, and sometimes the dice came up cruel. You lean back, staring at the candlelight flickering across the imagined page. The ink looks darker now, as if it knows it may one day be read, not by a beloved, but by a rival, a judge, or a furious spouse. You realize the cruel irony, the very permanence that made letters so precious. The way they preserved desire also made them weapons when affection soured or secrets spilled. In your mind's eye, the letter crumples, torn by trembling fingers, burned in a fireplace, or swallowed in a moment of desperation. But parchment resists. Even when destroyed, its memory lingers. Too many scandals in history began with nothing more than a folded page carried in a sleeve. You sigh softly. Love letters in the Middle Ages were always written on the edge of a knife, thrilling and dangerous in equal measure. They could lift two people into secret ecstasy or drag entire families into ruin. And as you set this phantom page aside, you can't help but wonder how many letters were lost forever, erased by fear, eaten by fire or by desperate mouths. Letters whose words still haunt the silence, unspoken but never quite gone. You step away from the smoky chamber of ruined households and into the draught of a gatehouse, where the wind smells of horses and damp wool. Here the stakes rise again, not just affairs within castles, but entire borders crossed under the weight of folded parchment. Love letters, you realize, did not respect kingdoms any more than they respected marriages. A mainstream fact for grounding, medieval Europe was a patchwork of territories, kingdoms, duchies, bishoprics, often at war, often uneasy allies. Yet letters travelled between them constantly, carried by merchants, pilgrims, envoys, and even spies. Romance followed those same roads. Some letters slipped across enemy lines, binding hearts where treaties had failed. Others crossed linguistic divides, mixing Latin with French, Italian with German, their authors fumbling for the right words, but determined to reach one another. You picture a knight in Aquitaine writing in halting French to a lady in Castile, his sentences tangled but sincere. Or a merchant's daughter in Bruges writing in Dutch and adding a line of Latin at the end, semper tuus, always yours, because it felt weightier in the scholarly tongue. Love stretched across rivers, mountains, and politics, sometimes succeeding where diplomacy stumbled. Quirky tidbit: one 14th century German letter included an entire section written phonetically in French, even though the writer clearly didn't know the language well. Scholars laugh at the spelling, but it's touching. He was imitating her tongue, clumsy but earnest, like the medieval version of someone trying to say, "I love you," in Google Translate. the mistakes made the sentiment even more intimate. Historians still argue whether these cross-border romances were common or rare. Some point to archives brimming with multilingual letters as evidence of widespread exchanges, especially among nobles who married across regions. Others insist that most were political documents with a sprinkling of affection, not true secret affairs. The truth perhaps lies in the smudges, love hidden inside lines about trade routes, dowries, or troop movements. You imagine the thrill of sending a letter into hostile territory, a folded slip tucked into a merchant's ledger, hidden under sacks of wool, or slipped between pages of a prayer book carried by a pilgrim. Each mile the letter travelled was a new risk. If caught, the words could be read as treason, not tenderness, and yet lovers took that gamble, trusting their emotions to roads rutted with mud and shadowed by brigands. Picture, too, the moment of arrival. A lady in a castle by the Pyrenees unfolds a note written in a clumsy hand. Smiling at the mix of languages, she reads it once for the meaning, twice for the sound, and then presses it to her chest as though holding the writer himself. In that moment, the letter is more powerful than armies. It conquers loneliness across mountains. There is humour here as well. Imagine a pilgrim monk grumbling about carrying letters he cannot read, muttering that these scraps weigh more than relics. Or a merchant's clerk who accidentally delivers a love note alongside an invoice, confusing both parties. Even mistakes like that remind you how human, how imperfect, how alive these exchanges were. The candle in your mind flickers lower, and you realize how remarkable it is. Ink and parchment traveled further than many of the people who wrote them. For some, letters became the only meeting place, a paper bridge between kingdoms. You close your eyes and hear the rattle of cartwheels on cobblestones, the creak of saddles, the shuffle of boots on icy passes. Somewhere on those roads, folded slips of parchment rustle inside satchels, carrying not just words but hope. And for a brief, fragile moment, love feels stronger than borders. You leave the borderlands behind, the sound of cartwheels fading into silence, and find yourself in the hushed shadows of a parish church. The smell of incense still clings to the air, and the carved confessional box looms like a wooden cave. Here, love letters take on yet another disguise, slipping under the veil of religion itself. A mainstream fact, confession was central to medieval life. By the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, every Christian was required to confess at least once a year. Priests became keepers of secrets, sinful desires, whispered faults, desperate longings. For lovers, that confessional space sometimes doubled as a loophole. A folded slip of parchment, presented under the guise of penance or spiritual counsel, could pass unseen into forbidden hands. Imagine it. You kneel in the darkened booth, voice trembling, whispering sins. Instead of only words of absolution, the priest slips a folded note into your hand, ostensibly a written prayer to recite later. You step out into the daylight, heart pounding, knowing the paper in your palm carries something far less holy. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some letters were disguised as devotional exercises. One, preserved in an archive, looks at first like a litany, pray this on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays, but every initial letter of each line spelled out the beloved's name. Another was written in the form of a psalm, complete with "O Lord" and "Amen," but the middle verses hid phrases like, "O Lady, my joy rests only in thee," holy camouflage for unholy desire. Historians still argue whether priests actively encouraged these exchanges or merely turned a blind eye. Some accounts accuse confessors of exploiting their role, using penance as cover for flirtation. Others suggest most priests remained stern gatekeepers, and only rare cases reveal abuses. The debate persists partly because so few physical examples survive. Most would have been destroyed, burned, or swallowed like bitter medicine the moment they risk discovery. You can almost hear the whispered rationalizations. If it passes through confession, perhaps it is sanctified. If I write my longing in the form of a psalm, perhaps God will forgive me. It's a dangerous game of bending vows into bridges, of sliding parchment through cracks in the moral walls. Picture the convent girl who receives a note tucked inside her prayer book, thinking at first it's just a copied homily, or the weary knight who unwraps a folded sheet disguised as a list of alms for the poor, only to find lines of aching devotion. The thrill of discovery was part of the love itself, half sin, half sacrament. There's humour in it too. Imagine a nervous young man accidentally handing his confessor the wrong folded page, his shopping list instead of his love letter. The priest opens it solemnly only to read cheese, onions, 2 candles, and a ribbon. Awkward silence, then maybe a cough to cover the mistake. But most often, the stakes were deadly serious. If discovered, these confessional exchanges could bring disgrace, excommunication, or worse. And yet human beings are relentless when desire burns. The confessional, designed to strip secrets bare, sometimes became the very place where new ones were born. The candle beside you, gutters low. You think about those slips of parchment, folded like absolution, tucked into hands, trembling with guilt and joy. You imagine them pressed into sleeves, hidden in girdles, slipped under pillows with the smell of incense still clinging. And as you sit in the dark, you realize the truth. Love letters were never just written on parchment. They were written on loopholes, on rituals, on the fragile spaces where faith and flesh overlapped. Ink in the shadows, longing in the margins, hope tucked between Our Father and Amen. You step out of the confessional's shadow into a hall where judgment feels heavier than incense. Here, parchment no longer trembles in a lover's hand. It slams against a table wielded by men in robes as cold as stone. This is the courtroom where letters become evidence, where passion is stripped of secrecy and recast as guilt. A mainstream fact for grounding, medieval courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, often admitted letters as proof in trials of adultery, treason, or conspiracy. The written word, so fragile in the moment of creation, carried enormous weight when unrolled before bishops or lords. In England's ecclesiastical courts, love notes could decide whether a marriage was annulled for infidelity. In France and the Empire, letters exposed nobles accused of treasonous liaisons. A folded scrap could alter inheritances, strip titles, or condemn someone to exile. Picture a scene. A parchment lies flat before the judge, its ink glistening under candlelight. The accused insists it was forged, the rival insists it is authentic. Servants are dragged in to testify who carried it, who sealed it, who glimpsed its delivery. The air is thick, not with romance, but with the raw stench of power. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval forensic science sometimes meant literally sniffing parchment. Judges or scribes would hold letters up to their noses to detect perfume or wax residue, claiming these were proof of authenticity. If it smelled of rosewater, clearly it had been carried by a lady. If it smelled of resinous wax, perhaps it matched the household of a particular knight. You laugh at the absurdity, but in those days, scent was testimony. Historians still argue whether letters were more often genuine evidence or convenient forgeries. The famous casket letters, allegedly from Mary, Queen of Scots, were used centuries later as proof of her adultery and conspiracy. Were they real or fabricated? Scholars are still divided. The ambiguity proves how fragile evidence could be in a world where ink could be copied, seals faked, handwriting imitated. Imagine the crushing moment of betrayal. A woman recognizes her own hand, her own lines of longing, now weaponized against her in a courtroom. Or a man, trembling, sees a note he never thought would surface, exposed to jeers and condemnation. Words written in private glow like embers when cast into public fire. The room in your imagination darkens further. You hear scribes scratching records, clerks murmuring, the accused weeping quietly. You realize that letters outlived the very secrecy they were meant to preserve. Instead of bonding two hearts, they could sever marriages, ruin reputations, even claim lives. And yet, even here, in the harshest light, those words still pulse faintly with the passion that birthed them. Judges might wag their fingers, clerks might sniff parchment, Families might wield them like blades, but somewhere inside each blot of ink is the same whisper. I could not stay silent. You set the letter aside with care, almost pity. You wonder how many lives were undone not by swords or poison, but by the courage or recklessness of ink on parchment. Love, once written, could never be unwritten. The courtroom fades, the murmurs of judges dissolving into a quieter, more desperate scene. You find yourself alone with a scrap of parchment that looks tampered with. The edges are uneven, the ink faint in places, the words scraped so thin you can see the grain of the skin beneath. This is where the story shifts from writing to unwriting, from confession to concealment. A mainstream fact first, medieval parchment made from animal skins was precious. It could be reused. By scraping off ink with a knife or pumice and smoothing the surface again, scribes created what's called a palimpsest. Usually this was done to recycle material for holy texts or important documents, but lovers too sometimes tried to erase their dangerous words, to rub away proof of forbidden affection before it was discovered. You lean close, and under candlelight you can still see ghostly traces, lines half erased, letters bleeding faintly through. A declaration of devotion lies buried under what now looks like a prayer or account of rents. To you it reads like a confession locked under another's disguise. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some erasures were so clumsy that the parchment actually tore, leaving gaping holes right in the middle of a sentence. One surviving fragment from France has only half a word left, the other half literally scraped out of existence. Scholars joke that the parchment itself blushed, hiding what it was never meant to reveal. Historians still argue whether most erased love letters were deliberate acts of self-protection or simply the natural recycling of expensive parchment. Did a trembling nun scrape away her own confession to a priest? Did a jealous husband force a servant to obliterate the note he caught? Or were most of these erasures just thrift, with later scribes repurposing parchment, unaware of the personal words underneath? Modern technology, ultraviolet lamps, multispectral imaging, has revealed erased texts that no one was meant to read again. Some are dry, but others are unmistakably intimate. You picture it vividly, a young man hunched over, knife in hand, scraping desperately as sweat drips down his temple. He thinks, if he can just make the words vanish, the danger will vanish too. The irony, of course, is that the ghost letters remain. Centuries later you can still trace them, like faint scars in the skin of an animal that once lived. Imagine the emotional weight of those actions. Erasure wasn't only physical, it was psychological. To scrape away your own words was to deny your own longing, to force your passion into silence. Yet it never truly disappeared. The parchment remembered. The fibers themselves clung to the ink like a lover refusing to let go. And then there is the humor. One scribe, annoyed at having to reuse a sheet, left a note in the margin. This parchment is full of nonsense. Little did he know the nonsense was a private poem about someone's aching heart. Centuries later, the joke's on him. We now prize those erased lines more than the dull text written over them. The candle sputters as you hold the ghostly page up to the light. You see faint words shimmering like secrets underwater. It feels intimate, almost intrusive, to read what was so carefully hidden. And yet here they are, the erased voices of lovers who tried and failed to blot themselves out of history. You realize something soothing and sad at once. Love doesn't vanish because you scrape it away. It lingers, faint as a watermark, visible only to those who know how to look. In every erased line, in every scar of parchment, you glimpse the stubborn persistence of human desire, refusing against all odds to be silenced. You let the scraped parchment slip from your hands and stumble into a quieter corner of memory, one where the words were never erased but decorated, where ink wasn't enough, so lovers reached for doodles. Here, in the margins of serious texts and in the folds of secret notes, you find small sketches that speak louder than any polished rhyme. A mainstream fact for grounding. Medieval manuscripts were often filled with marginalia, little drawings in the empty spaces, some playful, some obscene, some deeply symbolic. While not all were personal, many private letters and devotional books passed between lovers carried tiny hearts, flowers, or initials hidden among the lines. For those who couldn't write long, flowing verse, a simple sketch was enough to betray devotion. You hold one such scrap in your mind. At the bottom of an otherwise ordinary letter, there's a quick drawing of two birds perched together. Above them, initials are entwined, almost carelessly drawn, as though the writer couldn't resist claiming space for something more than words. Another note bears a flower, drawn so crudely it looks more like a starburst, but to the one who received it, it was the sweetest rose in the world. Here's a quirky tidbit. One medieval manuscript shows a monk doodling a tiny heart pierced by an arrow in the corner of a psalter. Centuries later, scholars wonder if it was a joke, an idle hand, or a secret sign left for someone who knew how to look. Some even argue these are the earliest forms of the love heart symbol we still use today. Imagine that, the emoji of affection, scrawled first by a distracted scribe in the 13th century. Historians still argue whether marginal doodles in manuscripts connected to convents or noble households were acts of idle play or deliberate signals. Was a heart scratched into the margin of a prayer book a mere whim, or a code between two people who knew its true meaning? The debate lingers unresolved, but the possibility feels deliciously mischievous. You picture the moment of creation. A knight, not skilled in poetry, presses quill to parchment and draws a clumsy heart. He hesitates, then adds an arrow, then shades it in as best he can. He knows the lines aren't graceful, but he also knows the woman who unfolds the letter will smile at it anyway. And perhaps she'll answer with her own sketch, a little flower, a star, even just her initial twined with his. There's humour in it too. Some doodles were less than subtle, crude figures of couples embracing, or exaggerated flowers with their stamens, clearly meant to suggest something else. You can almost imagine the suppressed giggles, the scandalized blushes, the delight of slipping such a page past the prying eyes of elders. But there's tenderness too. One fragmentary note, found in Germany, bore only a single word, yours, with a heart sketched beneath it. Nothing else. Perhaps the letter had once been longer, perhaps the writer ran out of courage. Whatever the reason, the surviving scrap feels powerful in its simplicity. You run your finger across the imagined sketch, and it strikes you. These little doodles may be the truest love letters of all. They bypass rhetoric, bypass coded metaphors, bypass jealousy and games. They are direct, clumsy, human. A crooked heart, a smudged flower, a set of initials. No court could debate them, no bishop could erase them. They were never meant to impress, only to connect. The candle beside you throws a soft halo across the page, and you picture lovers centuries ago tracing the same lines, smiling at the same clumsy drawings. Ink fades, parchment cracks, but the doodles remain. Small hearts scrawled in margins, still whispering across the centuries. I was here, I loved, I couldn't keep it inside. You set aside the doodled parchment and step into a room thick with suspicion. The air here feels colder, as though every draught carries a whisper. This is the world of censors and spies, the shadowy figures who made it their business to read what was never meant for them. A mainstream fact to steady you. By the later Middle Ages, royal courts and chancelleries kept entire offices of clerks who specialized in opening, reading, and sometimes even forging letters. Kings and queens feared treasonous correspondence, so their agents intercepted messages along roads, in taverns, or through bribed messengers. Love letters, though personal, often got caught in the same nets. If the words could topple dynasties, they could certainly ruin households. Picture the process. A spy unfolds a letter slowly, softening the wax over a flame so he can pry it open without leaving a mark. He copies the words carefully into a ledger, then reseals it with a forged impression of the sender's crest. By the time the letter reaches its intended recipient, the crown already knows its contents. You shiver, realizing how fragile trust must have felt when even folded parchment could betray you. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some spies grew so skilled they developed catalogues of wax seals, collections of impressions pressed into clay or lead so they could recreate them later. It's like the medieval version of password managers, except instead of autofill, you had a block of beeswax and a very steady hand. Imagine an archivist today finding a drawer filled with tiny wax discs, each one a stolen key to someone's heart. Historians still argue about the extent of these surveillance networks. Some claim royal censors primarily targeted political suspects, while others insist the appetite for scandal meant even private affairs were tracked and reported. The line between politics and passion blurred constantly. An affair with the wrong person could be spun as treason, while a love letter intercepted at court might ripple outward into gossip that shaped alliances. You imagine the dread of receiving a letter that looks perfectly sealed, only to realize later that your spouse already knows what was inside. Or worse, discovering your own words quoted back to you by an enemy, twisted in meaning, stripped of context. The ink you thought was private now glows under the torchlight of scrutiny. There's dark humor here, too. One intercepted love letter reportedly included such overblown metaphors. "I burn like a candle in your absence, I melt like wax itself," that the spies copying it burst into laughter. You can almost hear them snickering as they sealed it back up, mocking its passion even as they turned it into evidence. And yet, for all the surveillance, lovers adapted. Some began to invent codes and symbols, weaving private ciphers into their notes. Others sent deliberately boring letters, lists of household supplies, while slipping the true message between lines or hidden under flaps of parchment. A skilled reader might miss it, a beloved never would. The candle near you sputters as though it too is nervous. You realize the act of writing in the Middle Ages was never simple. It was always shadowed by the possibility of interception. Every time you dipped the quill, you were aware of invisible eyes hovering at your shoulder. Still, people wrote. Still, they risked, because no censor, no spy, no wax seal could smother the need to reach out, to confess, to connect. In fact, the danger may have sweetened the thrill. Each letter was both a confession and a dare. You lean back in the silence, thinking of the spies hunched over tables, the lovers whispering codes, the kings reading lines never meant for them. Love letters may have been fragile, but their danger made them unforgettable. And as the shadows lengthen around you, you sense that the next secret is already being inked, already folded, already slipped into a hand that may or may not be trusted. The shadows of the spies fade, and you step into a quieter chamber where a different kind of secrecy hums. This is not about interception or betrayal. It is about invention. Lovers, weary of being overheard and terrified of discovery, began to build their own code books, small dictionaries of symbols and substitutions that let passion travel safely under the noses of watchful eyes. A mainstream fact to ground you: ciphers and coded writing existed long before the Renaissance. Medieval scholars knew substitution alphabets, monks used shorthand notae, and merchants relied on secret marks in their account books. Lovers borrowed these same techniques, creating miniature cryptographies of the heart. A note filled with harmless symbols or scrambled letters could hide a line of fire, legible only to two people in the world. Imagine unfolding a page and seeing nothing but doodled stars, circles, and triangles. To everyone else, it looks like a child's game. But to you, each mark carries a sound, each cluster forms a word. I am yours only. The page is silent until you whisper it back into meaning. Here's a quirky tidbit. One Italian letter from the 15th century used playing card suits, hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds, not just as decorations, but as a full substitution system. Each suit, each number, mapped to a syllable. It looked like a gambling sheet, but hidden inside were words of longing. Historians grin when they see it now, calling it both encryption and flirtation. Historians still argue whether these codebooks were widespread tools or rare curiosities. Some point to scattered fragments of cipher alphabets in monastic manuscripts and merchant archives as evidence of common practice. Others insist that love letters rarely carried such technical trickery, that the surviving examples are too few to prove anything more than occasional use. Yet the mystery itself feels fitting. After all, what is romance if not a puzzle meant for two? You picture a couple carefully rehearsing their cipher. Perhaps they meet only once in a moonlit orchard, tracing symbols into the dirt, committing them to memory. Later their letters look like gibberish, but when the page is tilted, when the code is remembered, meaning flares like a hidden flame. The secrecy itself becomes part of the intimacy. We share a language no one else knows. There is humor here too. Imagine a poor messenger squinting at one of these notes, yet wondering why his master is suddenly obsessed with triangles and moons. Or a jealous husband raging over an undecipherable page, convinced it must contain scandal, but helpless to prove it. The absurdity must have been as delicious as the safety. Sometimes the codes were simple, a flower sketched in place of a name, an invented nickname that meant nothing to outsiders. Other times they were elaborate, full alphabets of strange marks. One surviving love poem even alternates languages line by line, Latin, French, Occitan, as though daring any outsider to follow along. For the beloved, the puzzle was not an obstacle but a gift. To decipher was to participate, to prove loyalty, to feel included in a secret world. The candle by your side flares, then steadies as though it too is guarding something. You realize how powerful it must have felt to cloak passion in symbols. A love letter wasn't just a confession, it was a test of trust, a riddle only one person could solve. You fold the imaginary cipher back into your sleeve, smiling at the thought of lovers hunched over parchment, drawing tiny keys to unlock what their hearts already knew. In the end, every code was more than protection. It was a declaration in itself. Our words belong only to us, even if the whole world tries to read them. You set aside the ciphered page, and the room grows stiller, cloaked in candle smoke and echoing footsteps. You are no longer in the halls of power or the chambers of nobles. Instead, the thick stone walls around you belong to a monastery. And here you find a scandal that no amount of codes or seals could contain. Love letters exchanged inside cloisters, tucked into hymnals and hidden under straw pallets, where desire smouldered despite vows meant to extinguish it. A mainstream fact to ground you. Monasteries and convents were not the perfectly sealed sanctuaries they were meant to be. Visitors came and went, tradesmen supplied food and wine, confessors entered regularly, and novices themselves often came from noble families with complicated ties. Scandals happened often enough that bishops issued repeated warnings against clandestine correspondence. Some convents were even investigated for patterns of secret letters smuggled in and out. Imagine the scene. A monk, weary from hours of copying psalms, slips a folded parchment beneath a choir book. A nun in a nearby convent opens her missal and finds a note carefully glued between two pages, invisible until you pull at the edge. The letters themselves were often cloaked as devotion, verses about divine longing that doubled as earthly love songs. To the outside world it was scripture. To two hearts it was fire. Here's your quirky tidbit. Scholars have uncovered entire caches of these cloistered notes preserved by accident. In one German convent, scraps of parchment were recycled as binding material for other manuscripts. Centuries later, conservators peeling back layers discovered faint phrases like, "I am yours, body and soul," scrawled in hurried Latin. Imagine the shock of finding passion literally pressed into the spine of a hymn book. Historians still argue whether these letters reflected actual affairs or whether they were more literary, written in imitation of courtly love traditions. Some say the language is too raw, too desperate to be mere exercise. Others caution that the stylized tone may be more about performance than experience. Yet either way, the fact remains. Desire had seeped even into cloisters, where silence was supposed to reign. You picture a nun sitting by candlelight, composing her letter. She writes on scraps of reused parchment, the back of a discarded charter perhaps, her words crammed between faded ink. Her lines blur together, half prayer, half plea. My soul longs for you as for Christ's own presence." Her quill scratches fast, as though the faster she writes, the less chance she has to regret. She folds it quickly, hides it in her sleeve, and waits for the bakery boy or the confessor who might smuggle it out. And then you imagine the monk on the receiving end, reading by the dim glow of an oil lamp. His hands tremble as he holds the letter, knowing one careless moment could destroy them both. Yet he reads it again and again, each time more slowly, as though savouring forbidden honey. There is humour here, too. One intercepted letter reportedly contained a crude drawing of two doves kissing, scrawled in the margin. The abbot who found it scribbled a note beside it. This is the work of idleness. You can almost hear his exasperated sigh, half scandalized, half resigned, knowing perfectly well that rules alone couldn't erase human longing. The candle near you flickers low, and the walls of your imagined cloister seem to lean closer. You realize that even in monasteries, space is carved for silence, prayer, and denial. The quill still carved its own dangerous paths. Love letters thrived in the very place meant to suppress them. You set the imagined parchment down and feel its weight long after it leaves your hand. The lesson is simple, almost soothing in its inevitability. Ink finds its way into every corner. No vow, no wall, no rule could keep desire entirely silent. The cloister hummed with psalms by day, but by night folded slips of parchment whispered just as loudly. You leave the cloister behind, its secrets still rustling in the hymnals, and step into a chamber glowing with lamplight and jewel tones. Here, parchment is not scraped thin or scribbled hastily. Instead, it gleams with gold leaf, lapis blue, and delicate vines curling around the margins. At first glance, it looks like a devotional book, but lean closer, and you realize you've stepped into the world of illuminated flirtations, where love letters masqueraded as piety. A mainstream fact, illuminated manuscripts were among the most prized possessions of the Middle Ages. Books of hours, psalters, and devotional texts were often richly decorated, their margins filled with saints, vines, animals, and bright initials. But the artistry also provided cover. Lovers sometimes disguised notes of affection within these ornate books, either by commissioning tiny images with double meanings or slipping letters between illuminated pages. Imagine a lady opening her book of hours for nightly prayer and finding a full-page miniature of a knight kneeling before the Virgin Mary. On the surface, it's devotion. But the knight's features look suspiciously like her admirer's, his colours matched to the ribbon she once gave him. To the untrained eye, it's holy art. Her, it's a portrait of longing hiding in plain sight. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some manuscripts included playful marginalia that could easily double as inside jokes between lovers. Rabbits jousting with snails, monkeys dressed as priests, lovers embracing in vines. Scholars debate whether these images were simply comic relief or subtle, personal nods. One book of hours even shows a man handing a letter to a woman in the margin, a literal sketch of what was happening off the page. Historians still argue whether such hidden flirtations were deliberate messages from scribes to patrons, or if later readers projected romance into innocent images. Were lovers truly commissioning sly miniatures of themselves, or are we moderns just too eager to find secret meanings? The answer may be both. Medieval art, like medieval letters, thrived on ambiguity. You picture it vividly, a woman kneeling in prayer, her fingers brushing the glowing page. She seems devout, but her lips curl at the corner as her eyes linger on a vine that twines into a heart, or an initial shaped suspiciously like a lover's crest. For her, every prayer becomes double, one to God, one to the man who dared to ink himself into her book. Sometimes illuminated manuscripts themselves carried hidden slips of parchment. A love letter could be tucked between gilded pages, blending into the shimmer of devotion. If discovered, it might be mistaken for a stray prayer or forgotten note. But to the one who placed it there, the golden glow of saints provided the perfect camouflage for sin. There's humour here too. One marginal doodle shows a nun chasing a monk with a stick, comic relief to us, but perhaps a cheeky wink for a particular reader. Imagine a lady pretending to laugh at the silly picture while secretly recalling her own dangerous correspondence. Even holy books weren't immune from becoming accomplices in love. The candle beside you flickers across a page painted with vermilion and gold, and you realize how clever these disguises were. Love letters could be poems, prayers, or pictures. They could glow in the margins of saints' lives, tucked into the folds of psalters, shimmering under the guise of devotion. You close the book carefully, almost reverently, as though you too are sealing away a secret. The truth hums in your ears. Ink always finds a way. Whether in clumsy doodles or golden illuminations, lovers carved their confessions where they could not be erased. Piety may have been the cover, but longing was always the light beneath the gold. You set aside the glowing manuscript, its gold leaf still shimmering in your imagination, and now you find yourself outside, in a courtyard where music drifts like incense. The strum of lutes, the rise of voices, and the tap of tambourines fill the air. This is not a church service, it's a troubadour's performance. And here, love letters take on a different form, lifted from parchment into melody, carried across courts as songs of desire. A mainstream fact, troubadours in southern France, trouvères in the north, and minnesingers in Germany thrived from the 12th century onward, composing poems and songs about love, loyalty, and longing. These verses often blurred the line between public performance and private confession. Many scholars believe that written love letters were sometimes adapted into these songs, or that songs themselves were later copied down and passed as letters. In noble courts, poetry and correspondence were two sides of the same coin, both feeding the culture of courtly love. You picture a troubadour stepping into the center of the hall, lute in hand, eyes scanning the gathered nobles. He begins to sing verses that sound generic enough to entertain the crowd, but one lady in the corner knows the words were lifted straight from a folded note she had sent weeks before. The rhyme, once private, now glitters as public praise, hidden in plain sight. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some songs even included instructions like, to be sung only in the presence of she who knows. Others were deliberately ambiguous, so that half the hall thought it was about virtue, while the intended listener blushed, recognizing her own coded reference. It's the medieval equivalent of slipping someone's initials into a pop song. Historians still argue whether troubadour songs always reflected real romances or whether they were mostly stylized performances. Were they thinly veiled declarations or simply exercises in rhetoric and art? Some insist the passion was authentic, pointing to recurring names and details that match known relationships. Others caution that most of it was theatre, entertainment dressed as longing. The truth, as always, probably sits between. Some verses were masks, others windows. Imagine a letter transformed into a chanson d'amour. Written words became sung words, easier to memorize, harder to trace. A song could travel across regions more freely than parchment, carried in memory, not bags. One knight might hear a familiar verse at a distant court and realize with a start that his rival had stolen not just his lady's affection, but her very words. And there was humour too. One surviving verse complains that the lady never answered his letter, so he turned it into a song and sang it in front of everyone. Imagine the mortified woman realizing her silence had become public performance. Medieval romance could be petty as well as poetic. You can almost hear it now, a low, lilting melody, words tumbling like water over stone. The song sounds like devotion to the Virgin to some ears, but the lady it was meant for knows better. She knows the falcon in the second stanza is hers, the rose in the refrain her own blush, the sweet mercy his plea for a reply. The candlelight in your mind flickers as the song fades. You realize that love letters weren't confined to ink. They spilled into voice, into rhyme, into the air itself. Parchment crumbled, wax seals cracked, but a melody could live on, reshaped, remembered, reborn. You step out of the courtyard, the last note still clinging to the air, and you feel a kind of ache. Letters whispered in secret could be erased. Letters sung aloud could ripple across kingdoms. Both were dangerous, both were beautiful, and both remind you that in the medieval world, longing never stayed silent for long. You leave the music of the troubadours behind, its echoes fading into the night, and enter a smaller chamber lined with tapestries. Here the air feels heavier, not with song, but with silence. On a table lies a folded sheet of parchment, and you can sense the ache inside it before you even touch it. This is the voice of loneliness, the letters written not to inflame passion, but to soothe despair in marriages that were more contract than companionship. A mainstream fact to ground you: most noble marriages in the Middle Ages were arranged for political advantage, not affection. Husbands and wives often lived apart for long stretches, sometimes in different households entirely. Many women were married off in their teens to much older men. Men, meanwhile, might spend years at war, on crusade, or at court. In such arrangements, the heart's hunger often had no sanctioned outlet. Love letters became the secret diary, the only place where longing could safely speak. You open one in your imagination and see the words of a wife who writes, "I am not loved in this house nor heard, and only your letters remind me that I live." The ink is shaky, the hand unpracticed, but the pain is clear. She clings to correspondence, not as a luxury, but as survival. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some letters of arranged marriages weren't even between lovers, but to stand-ins. A neglected wife might write to her husband's secretary or chaplain, begging him to pass messages along because the husband himself never answered. One frustrated noblewoman supposedly wrote to her absent spouse through the family steward, who finally scribbled back a line himself. My lord does not reply, but I assure you he read this. Imagine waiting months only to receive that as comfort. Historians still argue whether the majority of these letters represent genuine emotion or if they were stylized performances of expected roles, wives displaying obedience, husbands feigning affection. Some scholars see them as ritualized, almost formulaic, not unlike legal contracts. Others insist the rawness of certain passages shows authentic loneliness bleeding through the polite surface. The debate itself underscores how slippery emotion can be once it's written down. You picture a young bride in a drafty chamber, writing by firelight while her husband hunts miles away. She tells him she misses his presence at meals, that she feels invisible among his retainers, that she prays daily for his safe return. Her words might never move him, but they give her something she desperately needs, a sense of voice. There is humour here too, even amid the ache. One preserved letter from a wife complains that her husband writes too short, comparing his brief responses to half-baked loaves. Another adds a postscript scolding him for forgetting to send her wool for new gowns. Loneliness didn't erase wit. Sometimes sarcasm slipped into the margins like a sigh. The candle beside you flickers low, and you feel the weight of centuries of silence pressing down. These letters weren't embroidered with falcons and roses, they weren't gilded with song, they were plain, often desperate, sometimes angry. And yet they may be the most human of all because they reveal love letters not as luxuries, but as lifelines. You fold the imaginary parchment and set it gently aside, feeling the ache linger in your chest. Not all letters were perfumed with passion. Some carried only the scent of loneliness, the weight of longing in marriages arranged without care for hearts. Still, even in their sadness, they remind you, people wrote because they needed to feel heard. And sometimes the act of writing itself was the only reply they ever received. The quiet chamber of lonely marriages fades, and in its place you find yourself in a dim archive, shelves creaking under the weight of centuries. Scholars crouch with strange lamps and magnifying glasses shining beams across old parchment. Suddenly what seemed empty begins to glow. Words erased long ago, now resurrected by light. You realize you've entered the world of failed erasures, where love letters, once thought destroyed, rise again from the grave. A mainstream fact, medieval parchment was often reused. Old texts were scraped clean and written over, creating palimpsests. For centuries, those erased writings were invisible, but with modern technology, ultraviolet light, multispectral imaging, scholars now uncover ghostly words that lovers once tried to hide. These half-vanished letters prove that nothing written on parchment ever truly disappears. You watch as faint ink blooms under violet light. The outline of a phrase, the curve of a name, a man's trembling confession, "I burn with longing," reappears beneath the prayers layered over it. You feel almost like an intruder, peeking into a secret that someone fought hard to obliterate. Here's your quirky tidbit. One erased letter, discovered in a monastery binding, contained a tiny sketch of a heart pierced by 2 arrows. The erasure had faded it almost completely, but under scanning the drawing returned, like a medieval emoji rising from the dead. Imagine the shock of scholars who thought they were analyzing a psalter, only to find someone's love doodle glowing faintly underneath the psalms. Historians still argue whether the majority of rediscovered palimpsests reflect intentional concealment of scandalous words, or whether it was simply thrift. Parchment was costly, so scribes recycled whatever scraps they could find. Some insist that at least a few must have been deliberate, desperate attempts to destroy incriminating letters. Others argue that what we interpret as secret affairs might just be literary exercises erased like any other. The debate keeps archivists peering into the ghostly margins with equal parts reverence and suspicion. You picture the moment centuries earlier, a trembling woman scraping her own words with a knife, praying the marks will vanish, or a servant under orders erasing his master's careless confession late at night. The parchment resists, the fibers scar. They succeed mostly. Yet here you stand centuries later, reading it anyway. It's almost cruel. The very act of trying to silence love ensured its survival. There's humor in it too. One erased text turned out not to be scandalous at all, but a shopping list hidden under a sermon. Cheese, onions, ale. Imagine the disappointment of the scholar who expected a secret romance and found grocery errands instead. Even ghosts of ink can tease. Still, most fragments carry ache. You lean closer to one, the words barely visible. "Forgive me, I cannot forget you." The plea, once scraped away, now flickers back into view. You wonder if the sender ever knew the erasure failed, if the beloved lived, never realizing her secret, survived. The candle beside you burns low, casting long shadows across the shelves. You realize these ghost letters are a kind of time travel, not just into history, but into the exact moment someone thought they could erase love with a knife. They couldn't. The parchment remembers. You step back into the silence, heart heavy but strangely comforted. Even when lovers tried to blot themselves out of history, their words clung to the fibers. Centuries later, it brings them back, faint and trembling, but alive. And perhaps that is the truest lesson of all. Passion leaves scars, and some scars shine when you least expect them. The glow of ultraviolet lamps fades from your mind, and you drift into a quieter space where the evidence of love no longer lies in erased fragments, but in echoes. You find yourself surrounded by shelves of parchment covered with words that repeat again and again, yours only, heart's prisoner, ever faithful. It feels like stepping into a chorus, a refrain sung by countless hands across centuries. A mainstream fact, medieval letters, whether from nobles, clerics, or commoners, often relied on stock phrases. Much like today's yours truly or with love, lovers used set formulas to anchor their passion in familiar language. Phrases like "I am your servant" or "bound to you in body and heart" occur with striking frequency in collections of surviving correspondence. This doesn't make them insincere, it makes them part of a shared vocabulary of longing. You trail your fingers across one such letter. The words are not unique, but they feel universal. You imagine a knight in Normandy writing, "I am your prisoner," and a merchant's daughter in Bruges writing the same, both drawing on a script bigger than themselves. Love had its clichés then, just as it does now, and maybe those clichés are what made it endure. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some lovers grew playful with these stock phrases, twisting them for humour. One man wrote, "I am your servant," though poorly paid and badly fed, turning a formal phrase into a cheeky joke. Another ended his letter with, "Yours until the last ale is drunk," proving even passion could stumble into the tavern. Those jokes, smudged into the margins, make the centuries melt away. You can almost hear the chuckle behind the quill. Historians still argue whether these recurring formulas reflect true emotion or simply rhetorical training. Were writers genuinely confessing or just parroting what they were taught in the ars dictaminis schools of letter writing? Some scholars point to the rawness of smudged ink and hurried scrawls as proof of sincerity. Others insist that repetition shows convention rather than confession. Perhaps it doesn't matter because for the lovers, those familiar words were enough. You smile at the thought, repetition itself becomes intimacy. Every letter might begin with the same line, but the beloved still read it as singular, personal, theirs alone. Just as modern lovers recycle "I miss you" 1,000 times without it losing power, medieval lovers leaned on their formulas like familiar doorways, always opening onto the same secret garden. Picture a woman unfolding a letter and seeing, yet again, "I am your faithful servant." She knows he's written it before, but her heart still jumps. Or imagine a man receiving "Forever yours only" for the 10th time. He laughs, but he still tucks it into his tunic like a treasure. The phrases echo across Europe, across decades, but for each pair, they sound brand new. The candle beside you flickers and you realize you're surrounded not by one voice, but by a chorus. All those prisoners of love, all those faithful servants, all those yours onlys blend together like a chant, layered across parchment, binding lives that never met. You fold one imaginary page and feel the rhythm still beating in your chest. Repetition wasn't laziness, it was comfort, certainty, ritual. In a world where so much was unstable, wars, plagues, shifting loyalties, the steady echo of familiar phrases might have been the most reassuring love of all. The chorus of repeated phrases fades into a softer hum, and now you find yourself in a room where the letters are no longer hidden. They are displayed, copied, cherished. These are the ones that outlived their senders, surviving long enough to be gathered into chronicles, poetry collections, even legends. Passion, once secret, has become part of history. A mainstream fact, many medieval love letters, especially those between famous figures, were preserved not by accident, but because scribes recopied them for posterity. The most famous are the exchanges between Heloise and Abelard, whose correspondence has been studied for centuries. Other collections of model letters, called formularies, included examples of romantic epistles alongside political ones, ensuring that the language of love lived on long after its original purpose was gone. You imagine a scribe carefully copying a scandalous note, pausing to shake his head but still preserving every word. To him, it's practice in penmanship. To us, it's an artifact of passion. The sender never intended it to outlive a single heartbeat. Yet here it is, centuries later, inked again and again. Here's your quirky tidbit. One medieval collection of exemplary letters used for teaching students actually included a fake love letter as a writing exercise. Generations of schoolboys learned to write, "My heart is bound to you forever," without ever realizing they were practicing with words that once broke real hearts. In a strange way, romance became homework. Historians still argue whether preserved letters give us real glimpses into medieval intimacy or whether they've been heavily edited, even fictionalized. Were Heloise and Abelard's letters copied faithfully, or did later monks clean them up, cutting the most scandalous lines? Some letters survive only in chronicles where they may have been altered to fit moral lessons. Others, tucked away in archives, show messier, rawer voices. The debate leaves you wondering how much of what we read is genuine and how much is reshaped by other hands. Yet, even if polished, the letters still pulse with emotion. A king's plea to his mistress, a nun's aching confession, a merchant's awkward verse, all survive as fragments of lives that refused to vanish. Once private, they became public, sometimes against the writer's will, sometimes through the curiosity of later centuries. You picture readers long after the lovers' deaths, unfolding the parchment with a mix of awe and scandal. A 14th century scholar reads Abelard's Lament and sees a moral tale. A 19th century romantic reads the same and sees tragic devotion. Now you, too, sit in that line of readers, inheriting words written with trembling hands hundreds of years ago. There's humour here as well. Some letters were so dramatic they inspired mockery in later ages. One overly flowery French note was recopied into a parody book that exaggerated its metaphors, turning the poor lover into a laughing-stock across generations. Even in preservation, passion could be twisted, but many letters were cherished with reverence. Lovers who died young left behind scraps that families, or sometimes whole towns, treated like relics. They became legends: the knight who wrote until his ink ran dry, the lady whose last words were found in a folded note beneath her pillow. Letters transformed from fragile scraps into monuments of memory. The candle near you flickers across the stack, and you realize that what was once secret has become eternal. Love letters outlived their affairs, their scandals, even their shame. They became literature, history, legend. The passion faded, the lovers died, but the ink carried on, whispering across centuries. We were here, and we loved, and we could not be silent. The shelves of preserved letters fade, and you find yourself in a quiet chamber, lit only by a single candle. Before you lies one last scrap of parchment, its edges curling, its ink faded almost to invisibility. You lean closer, and though the words are faint, you can still make them out. This is the final whisper of 1,000 secret voices, a mainstream fact to anchor you. Few medieval letters survive intact. Most were lost to fire, flood, or deliberate destruction. What remains is only a fraction of what once filled the air. And yet the fragments we do have reveal a world where ink was courage, parchment was hope, and folded slips carried more danger than swords. You read the fragile lines. If these words find you, know I am ever yours, though time and distance may part us. The ink trembles, the hand falters. It is not poetry, not coded, not erased. It is simply human, a last attempt to capture longing before silence claims it. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some letters were literally buried with their recipients. Archaeologists have found folded scraps tucked into coffins, as if the dead carried their words into eternity. Imagine a parchment lying against the chest of a skeleton, still whispering across centuries, stubborn as ever. Historians still argue whether love letters should be treated as historical data or as literature. Are they evidence of how people lived, or are they stories, crafted, exaggerated, polished by desire? Perhaps they are both. Each letter is both fact and fiction, both confession and performance. What matters is not their accuracy, but their survival, the fragile persistence of love inked into animal skin. The candle burns low, its wax pooling like blood-red seals. You imagine all the letters you've held across this long journey, perfumed notes, jealous scribbles, coded riddles, erased confessions, golden illuminations, plaintive cries of lonely wives, exuberant rhymes of troubadours. Together they weave a chorus, not of saints or kings, but of ordinary hearts who refused silence. The last words fade into the parchment, and you realize the truth. Love letters never belonged fully to their writers. The moment they were inked, they became alive, carried by servants, intercepted by spies, judged in courts, sung in halls, preserved in archives, rediscovered centuries later. They slipped free of hands and time, lingering long after their lovers were gone. And now, as your own candle flickers down to a stub, you set the final scrap aside. Its ink dissolves into memory, its voice softens into silence, and you lean back, letting the weight of centuries drift away. The story slows now, like footsteps softening on a long road. You've wandered through chambers and cloisters, courtyards and courts, tracing the faint lines of lives lived long ago. The letters you held are fragile things, ink stains on skin, pressed flowers, whispered codes, but together they form a tapestry of longing that still hums in the quiet. As the images fade, you notice your own breath has slowed, rising and falling like the turning of parchment. The bustle of tournaments, the whispers in confessionals, the laughter of courts, all drift away, leaving only the steady hush of night. The words that once burned with risk and passion are now softened, like ash cooling after a fire. You imagine the letters dissolving one by one into gentle dust. The wax seals melt into harmless pools. The scribbled hearts in the margins fade to pale outlines. What remains is not scandal or danger, but a kind of tender echo, proof that people have always reached across distance, always longed to be heard, always dared to write what they could not say aloud. The candle in your mind gutters low, its flame bends once, twice, then steadies into a glow no brighter than a star at the horizon. You hear nothing now but the quiet rustle of pages turning slower, softer, until the book of this night's journey finally closes. Let that softness wrap around you like a blanket. Let the voices of the past recede into sleep. And as you drift, remember only this: every heart in every age has tried to speak itself onto the page. Tonight you've listened. Tonight you can rest.